Part 1, Babylon After Dark. Hey guys, tonight, let's dim the lights, take a slow breath, and drift back, about 4,000 years, to a place where the air smelled like clay, smoke, and sweet date wine. Welcome to ancient Babylon. Now, Babylon wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd want to wake up hungover in, mostly because waking up meant another day of taxes, gods who needed constant attention, and the ever-present smell of the Euphrates River doing whatever ancient rivers did before sanitation existed. But at night, Babylon came alive. Not in a flashing neon way, of course, more like a slow burn of flickering oil lamps, soft music from reed pipes, and people trying their best to ignore the oppressive heat and the fact that the city walls were about as subtle as a divine ego problem. Let's settle in, because the Babylonians didn't really party, they ritualized. Everything had layers of religion, of duty, of wanting to impress whichever god was in charge of your mood that week. As the sun dropped behind the ziggurats, those massive, step-like temples that looked like someone tried to build a skyscraper out of baked mud, the city's noise shifted. Merchants folded up their stalls, slaves carried water back to the courtyards, and somewhere, in the alleys between the temple precincts, the night workers began to appear. You had your tavern keepers, almost always women, and usually the kind who knew way too much about everyone's private business. You had flute players, beer brewers, and dancers. And you had the professional companions, who weren't exactly considered scandalous. Because in Babylon, pleasure wasn't sinful, it was divine logistics. There were temples where the goddess Ishtar, Lady of Love and War, a dangerous combination, was honored with songs, incense, and allegedly, ritual intimacy. Though historians are still debating how much of that was actual temple practice and how much was Greek gossip that got out of hand later. Still, the Babylonians did believe that love and fertility pleased the gods. So, the city's nightlife wasn't just entertainment. It was a kind of spiritual maintenance, a celestial date night with the divine. Meanwhile, in the richer parts of town, the elite had their own way of doing nightlife. Palatial banquets were a big deal, long, slow affairs with endless platters of food, music, and what we'd politely call ceremonial drinking. There were no forks, of course, just fingers, and servants to wipe them when things got sticky. It was all about showing off the wealth, the imported spices, the jewelry that looked like it could pay for an entire neighborhood. And yet, despite all this glam, ancient Mesopotamians were famously anxious people. Their gods were moody, the weather was unpredictable, and every eclipse felt like a bad Yelp review from heaven. So, after their feasts, people often went to bed clutching little clay charms, hoping to ward off nightmares, demons, or the occasional curse sent by a jealous neighbor. Let's float a little deeper into the night, past the houses and the taverns, to the temple quarter where things got complicated. The priests and priestesses were technically supposed to represent divine order, but as it turns out, divine order liked to unwind too. There are records and a few very disapproving letters suggesting that temple festivals could get pretty wild. Food, drink, incense, and ecstatic rituals that blurred the line between worship and nightlife. Imagine the moon hanging low over the ziggurat, drums echoing softly through the air, and the scent of frankincense drifting like smoke from a dream. People danced barefoot in the courtyards. Chants rose and fell in the dark. It wasn't chaos, not exactly. More like a rhythmic surrender, a reminder that life and pleasure were gifts from gods who, frankly, needed a lot of appeasing. And then, eventually, the fires would burn low. The dancers would drift home, and the city would return to its usual symphony of dogs, distant arguments, and the hum of the river. The funny thing about Babylonian nightlife is that it wasn't really separate from the day. There was no work hard, play hard mindset. It was all one long cycle of ritual, duty, and trying not to offend the divine bureaucracy in the sky. But still, you can almost picture it. A warm, heavy night. Music somewhere in the distance. Someone whispering a prayer to Ishtar under their breath. And in the flicker of lamplight, the quiet pulse of a civilization trying to feel alive under the eyes of 1,000 gods. Let's slowly drift from Babylon's lamplit streets and follow the trade routes west, across the desert, past the silent ruins, toward the shimmer of the Mediterranean. Because the next city that never really slept was Athens. And if Babylonian nights were about ritual, Athenian nights were about talking too much and pretending to be deep. But we'll save that for the next part. Part 2. Athens After Dark. Hey again. If you're still awake, well, congratulations. You've made it out of Babylon, which, statistically speaking, puts you ahead of most people who live there. Tonight, let's settle into the soft hum of another ancient city, one that liked to think of itself as the brain of the ancient world, Athens. Now, Athens had a thing for ideas, democracy, philosophy, architecture, and of course, dramatic public breakdowns disguised as theater. But beneath all that marble and self-importance, the Athenians had a nightlife that was equal parts genius, chaos, and cheap wine. And unlike Babylon's pious night rituals, Athenian nights were more like dinner parties that got way out of hand. So let's dim the torchlight, pour some questionable wine, and watch as the philosophers, soldiers, and poets start to blur into a very human mess. Evening in Athens began with sound. The clang of blacksmiths winding down, the clatter of carts on stone streets, and the chatter of markets closing for the day. The Agora, that big public square where everyone argued about everything, slowly emptied out. Philosophers packed up their scrolls, vendors gathered their coins, and somewhere, in the shadows of the Acropolis, a chorus of frogs began doing whatever frogs did before people invented white noise machines. Dinner came late, after sunset. For most Athenians, that meant something simple: bread, olives, maybe some fish if you were lucky. But for the elite, that's when the symposiums began. Now, symposium sounds very respectable, like a polite academic gathering. In reality, it was, well, imagine a frat party hosted by Plato and funded by a minor aristocrat with too much money and not enough supervision. Symposiums were men-only events. Sorry, ladies, unless you were a courtesan, a musician, or someone who could recite poetry while playing a flute, you weren't on the guest list. Guests reclined on couches in a circle. Wine mixed with water flowed freely. Yes, they diluted it, because drinking it straight was considered barbaric, which didn't stop them from drinking too much of it anyway. And between the cups of wine, the philosophical debate started. Is beauty truth? What is justice? How do we define virtue? Or, more realistically, whose turn is it to sing next? And why did someone bring a donkey inside? It was part dinner, part debate, part chaotic social experiment. Musicians played softly, servants refilled cups, and somewhere between the fifth and sixth round, somebody usually decided to quote Homer dramatically or challenge someone to an arm wrestling match, because why not test your virtue and your biceps? The Athenians loved the night. It was when the city's constant arguments softened into song and poetry. After all, Athens wasn't just about marble temples, it was about stories. You'd find small gatherings in courtyards, where poets read their verses under the stars. Street performers did imitations of famous orators, basically ancient stand-up comedy minus the microphone. And lovers wandered the olive groves, whispering dramatic lines stolen straight from tragedy plays. Of course, every city has its seedier corners, and Athens had plenty. Down near the Piraeus harbor, the air smelled like salt, sweat, and roasted fish. Sailors stumbled between taverns. Dice games went on for hours. And if you listened closely, you'd hear half a dozen languages: Phoenician, Egyptian, Persian, all mingling in the smoky air. The taverns weren't fancy. Rough wooden tables, wine in clay cups, and enough gossip to fill an amphitheater. Women ran many of them, and if you asked too many questions about their business model, you'd probably end up outside wondering where your sandals went. Now, like Babylon, Athens didn't see nightlife as divine duty. There were no temple feasts for the goddess of love here. The Greeks preferred to keep their gods in daylight, mostly except for Dionysus. Ah yes, Dionysus, god of wine, madness, theater, and regrettable decisions. If any deity ever understood nightlife, it was him. Festivals in his honor, especially the Dionysia, were basically week-long city-wide parties disguised as religious events. There was drinking, dancing, and massive theatrical performances where half the city showed up to watch plays about love, betrayal, and fate being, well, a jerk. And after the performances, people poured into the streets, singing hymns, laughing, probably arguing about whether Sophocles was overrated. It wasn't debauchery, exactly. It was ritualized catharsis, the Greeks' favorite word for emotional meltdown with better lighting. But nightlife in Athens wasn't all joy and laughter. Behind the chatter, there was always an undercurrent of insecurity. Citizenship was a fragile thing. Slaves outnumbered citizens, and even the freest man could find himself broke, mocked, or exiled if he offended the wrong person. So when the night fell, it wasn't just time to relax, it was time to escape. From the politics, from the wars, from the constant pressure to sound clever. For a few hours, under the stars, people could be just people again, dancing, drinking, whispering, laughing too loudly. The city of reason gave way to something softer, more human. Let's drift a little deeper, toward the shadow of the Acropolis. There, the air was cooler, filled with the scent of olive trees. Sometimes, young men would gather to sing love songs, mostly. Sometimes, secret lovers met under statues of gods who had definitely seen it all before. And if you listened long enough, you'd hear the city breathing. A slow rhythm of footsteps, laughter, and the occasional donkey braying like it was auditioning for a tragedy chorus. Night in Athens was never truly silent. Even the gods seemed to linger, perhaps amused by their mortal children trying to make meaning out of wine and moonlight. By dawn, the fires would fade. Servants cleaned the courtyards. The philosophers sobered up just enough to declare that nothing in excess was a good idea, a lesson they would forget by the next evening. And as the sun rose over the Parthenon, the whole city pretended to be wise and serious again. But under that marble calmness, you could still feel it, the heartbeat of a city that lived two lives. One in daylight, with reason and order, and one at night, where music, laughter, and wine made everyone forget, just for a moment, how fragile civilization really was. Let's drift onward again, past the Aegean, over sand and sea, toward another city where the nights shimmered differently, a little more mysterious, a little more perfumed. Because if Babylon's nights were ritual, and Athens were intellectual chaos, Egypt's were something else entirely, a mix of the sacred and the surreal. And that's where we'll float next. Part 3, Egypt After Dark. If you're still here, still awake, or maybe half asleep, that's fine. This is the kind of story that doesn't mind if you drift off mid-sentence. Because Egypt at night was always half dream anyway. Let's drift down the Nile. The water's dark, smooth, and endless, like black glass reflecting the stars. You can hear the faint slap of oars, a few frogs, the soft hum of the wind through reeds. And somewhere ahead, there's a city glowing faintly with oil lamps. Thebes, maybe, or Memphis. One of those places where gods were so common you could accidentally bump into one while fetching bread. Egyptians lived by the rhythm of the sun. Ra rose, work began. Ra set, and the world softened. But when the sun god went to the underworld each night, the people didn't just go to sleep. They slipped into their own kind of twilight world, halfway between devotion and daily life. In Part 4, Rome After Dark, if you've made it this far, you've walked through Babylon's shadows, listened to Athens talk itself in circles, and floated down the Nile under the stars. Now, we've arrived in the capital of drama itself, Rome. Rome by day was loud, proud, and constantly trying to impress itself. You had senators shouting, soldiers marching, and markets that smelled like wine, fish, and ambition. But when night fell, the city changed. The marble looked softer, the air grew cooler, and the same people who built empires spent their evenings doing what humans have always done, eating too much, gossiping, and trying not to get caught. So let's settle into the soft candlelight of a Roman evening, and see what really went on after dark in the empire that never quite knew moderation. The first thing to know about Roman nightlife is, it wasn't for everyone. If you were poor, you probably went to bed early, mostly because you had one room. Part 5, Medieval Nights. Fear, fire, and ale. People like to say the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of darkness. And, well, at night, they really were. No lamps, no neon, not even a glimmer except for moonlight and the fire you hoped wouldn't burn down the thatch roof. So, Let's tuck ourselves inside a medieval night, in a small village somewhere in England, maybe France, maybe nowhere in particular. The day ends with smoke. The fields are quiet, the animals herded in, and everyone heads home. The cottage smells of wood, wool, and bread that's mostly crust. Dinner is whatever was left over from noon: thick soup, ale, maybe a bit of onion if it was a good day. And then, nothing. No sound except the crackle of the fire and the occasional cow being dramatic outside. For most people, night was for sleeping, but not the deep. Part 6. Renaissance Nights: Artists, Courtiers, and Whispers. Let's open the shutters just a little. Let a thin stripe of moonlight fall across the page and drift into the Renaissance. The word means rebirth, but at night, it wasn't exactly angels and inspiration. It was paint, perfume, gossip, and too much wine poured by someone who really should have gone home hours ago. If the medieval world went to sleep with its saints, the Renaissance stayed up with its artists. Florence, Venice, Paris, cities that hummed after dark with the sound of lutes, footsteps on cobblestones, and the soft laughter of people who thought they were living at the center of the universe. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Let's start in Florence. By day, it was a city of bankers and geniuses, all arguing about proportion, virtue, and who owed whom a favor. But by night, the workshops glowed. Apprentices. Part 7. The Age of Enlightenment: Coffee, Candles, and Conspiracies. We've wandered through temples, taverns, and palaces, and somehow, we've made it to the 18th century. By now, the world has learned to stay awake, and not just awake caffeinated, because this is the age when thinking became a social event, and coffee was basically rocket fuel for ideas. Let's start in Paris, because of course we do. By day, the city was crowded, noisy, and a little smelly. But by night, oh, Paris was perfect. Candles glowed through the fog, horse hooves echoed on wet cobblestones, and inside the cafes, minds buzzed faster than ever. You'd find Voltaire hunched over a cup, scribbling furiously about freedom and reason, probably while insulting at least 3 people per paragraph. Across the room, Diderot was arguing with Rousseau, both Part 8. The Industrial Night: Gaslight, Smoke, and the Birth of the 24-Hour City. Hey again, you've stayed with me this far, so you already know the night has never really been silent. But by the 19th century, it became louder, busier, and honestly, a little more exhausting. Because humanity finally figured out how to turn darkness into profit. And once that happened, there was no going back. Gaslight was the first domino. It began in London. Where else? Around the early 1800s. The city flickered to life with soft yellow flames trapped in glass. Whole streets, glowing for the first time since Rome fell apart. People came out just to stare at it. This new artificial dawn. Theaters stayed open later. Shops extended their hours. Workers trudged home at midnight instead of sunset. And the line between day and night, work